Hi, Misha here, and recently Forgotten Weapons did a video on the good old Australian Lithgow L2A1 heavy barrel version of the L1A1 FAL derivative. And I haven't really done an FAL video in a while because I haven't really had anything new to show you or talk about, but what the hey, I thought I would bring mine out again and kind of expand upon it, and also talk about some of the various 30-round magazines available for the inch pattern, so-called L1A1s and L2A1s. Now this gun here is one of the DSA receivers. They did an Australian pattern several years ago. The major difference between an Aussie pattern and an English or British pattern is this lightning cut here, the styling. And they were even so kind as to give it a American serial that started with AD, much like the guns made for the Australian military. It's also worth pointing out that semi-autos, L1A1As from Lithgow, had SAF on them. But this has some really interesting, unique features, so I thought we would just briefly visit it. Why not? I just really like talking FALs. In the rear, it's the same as an Australian L1A1. Wood stock and grip. As you see, a standard 20-round mag fits Jim Dandy. We have a more or less standard receiver. The lower is only slightly different. We'll talk about when I flip it over. The carry handle is actually a very similar pattern, but it's angled a little bit differently than on your usual L1A1. And our rear sight is a unique pattern here that is actually based on the original Canadian C2 rear sight. Now the C2A1 was different, but the original C2 used this style of rear sight. Moving forward, we have this unique handguard that doubles as a bipod with these wooden planks. We have an exposed gas tube, very thick, heavy barrel. We'll take a look at more. And we have an interesting front sight gas block with these ears that are actually removable. They're not fixed. That's kind of a later style from Australia, and one could suppose that was done so they could be easily replaced. You wouldn't have to replace the entire block. And then moving out, we have the heavier barrel. It's still the standard 21-inch FAL length. And then we have a standard 5-slot flash hider with bayonet lug, while the British L1A1 would go to a 3-slot later on. The Australians would keep on with the 5. Also, whereas the British would do the kind of Sunkerite finish to the metal, the Australians would keep on with the phosphate. And the British would originally use wood furniture for their L1A1, but then go to the Marinil polymer. But again, Australia, while they would change their furniture a bit for their L1A1, they would keep on with wood. So, just some differences there. And carry handles would change a bit in Australia. Again, especially on the L1A1 as time would go on. But yeah, the Lithgow factory would set up to produce first the L1A1 in 1959. And would continue building them, if you count the semi-autos, until about, well, full production about through 85, and then building from existing parts to about 88. The L2A1, the heavy barrel, potentially the squad automatic version, would enter into production a couple of years later. I've seen 1960, 1961, 1962 is the beginning. And they would build these through the early 80s. I've seen 80 through 82 as potential end dates. And they would mass produce the L1A1, but of course the L2A1 being a specialized weapon, they would build fewer than 10,000, and fewer than half of those would stay with the Australian military. New Zealand would acquire some, as would Malaysia, and a handful of others. Interestingly, the L2A1 would see a decent amount of combat in the hands of Australian soldiers in Vietnam. At that time, they would actually cut the barrel down for some and remove the bipod, installing sometimes an underbarrel grenade launcher, make it into a shorter and somewhat lighter gun that they affectionately called the bitch, or the bitch rifle. And there's of course stories to be told with the 30-round mags. But hey, let's flip this over and also put her on the bipod. So here we go. Here's the other side of the receiver in our stock over here. It has the typical folding charging handle, pretty identifiable as an inch pattern or imperial pattern, although the paratrooper metric from Belgium would also use a similar version of this. We have our top cover here. Note that the Australian is not cut for chargers or stripper clips as the C1A1. But if we look at this side, we can see the one big difference. The L1A1 from Australia, much like the C1, C1A1, and British L1A1, was safe and semi-auto, hence why it was called the SLR, the self-loading rifle. But the L2A1, much like the C2 and C2A1, as well as the C1A1D from Canada, also had a third position for automatic. So the lowers were a little bit different in the terms of their markings. And you have this big change levers, the British called it, with the 3 positions, which makes sense considering the role of this gun. Not a big change. Of course, the lower would be marked. Also, the plunger behind the trigger is a little different. But otherwise, it's the same. We have standard mag release for an L1A1, the kind of large, oversized style. We have the standard manual bolt hold open, not the automatic style. There's no pin. And of course, once our bipod is folded down, we have a very exposed, heavy barrel. We have a kind of a coupler in the back here. And these are metal lined, of course, because it doubles as a bipod with these legs. One of those things that probably seemed great in concept when they were testing it out, because when you combine a handguard and bipod like this, you do save a lot of weight. You also give extra cooling for the barrel, and gas tube for that matter. But of course, I think you can see the issue. This bipod is quite quick removable too. It has a pin with a smaller pin securing it behind. You can pull that out and pull it off. And this is a slightly longer sling, intended for use on these kinds of LMGs or squad automatic. This is still, of course, a closed bolt, even though this is on a semi-automatic receiver. And yes, this is the gun part for an FAL. The lower is a trigger housing, so that's why you can still have the selectors. Anyway, it was always a closed bolt, Same locking system, and of course the barrel is not QD in any way, shape, or form. And it can take the standard bayonet. So yeah, here, let's see, I took out our little 20 round mag. Let's look at some of the 30s here. Now this is a standard metric kind of FN, I'll do this here so you can see, kind of FN style. See, it's quite a bit longer. The major differences between metric and inch: if you look at the metric, it has a very simple floor plate with just folded over steel, and it has a very simple little nipple in the front for locking. When they did the inch for the Allied Rifle Steering Committee, they went to a very pronounced front lug that's actually welded on, brazed on, and they went to a much heavier dutier floor plate. Honestly, an inch mag is it's going to be better, but a metric will actually fit in an inch gun. Yeah, it'll fit, but it'll fit with slop. Actually, because of this receiver and everything, this one fits a little tighter. But generally, you can get a metric to go in, but it's going to have wiggle wobble and not the best. But it will work in a pinch. So that's the metric. Now here we have an actual 30 round L2 mag. So same basic dimensions. It just has the imperial floor plate and imperial locking tab, and it would have had a phosphate finish, be it Australian or Canadian. And while these mags were produced and even fielded, as Forgotten Weapons correctly pointed out, they were not best loved. For one thing, they're very long, as you'd expect, and they just weren't all that reliable for what they were. And this wasn't just an L1, L2 problem. This was something, see how there's it kind of monopods on it. This was something that was experienced with metric, so-called FALOs, FALOs. The 30 rounders just never worked great. In fact, most nations that would even use the FALO, the FALO, like say Israel, would stick with a 20 round mag, and really Canada and Australia would too, practicality. But I have one more here I wanted to show you, kind of interesting. This is probably the most common in the US of A. Now see if you can see a difference here. Still has the same floor plate, same front locking tab, but if you notice, it is a little bit longer and it is curved. This is an L4A1 magazine from the UK. Britain didn't adopt a version of the L2 or the C2 or the FALO. They instead reworked their trusty old Bren guns to fire 7.62 NATO, naming them as the L4. But since they did have the L1A1 rifle, the magazines were generally speaking the same and interchangeable. And they will fit in an FAL just fine. Or in a L2 in this case. And for a while, DSA was selling these, and they weren't ripping people off. They told them what they were getting. But you will run across these L4 Bren mags, even some where they cut this front tab off to make them metric compatible. But remember what I said about the spring and the factory L2 mags. Well, that goes doubly so. These are known for weak springs in the L4 mags because, of course, for a Bren gun, they were upside down. So they used gravity to help with the feed. Again, worked perfectly fine for a Bren, but when you make it upside down, plus adding the slight curve, certainly not reliable. Of course, reliability was better when this was used on semi-auto. When you go to full auto, you need the magazine to present the round faster, and that's kind of what happened. The bolt could outrun the mag. On the other hand, some from the South African conflict speculated that full auto fire, because of its agitation, increased vibration, actually improved reliability a bit. So there's a little bit of mixed results. But most nations that really tried the heavy barrel FAL, we're not super impressed, because this heavier barrel and bipod just adds a bit of weight. But again, this rear sight is certainly unique for Australia and Canada. It's one of the few times you'll see an FAL sight mounted on the top cover rather on the rear part of the lower frame. Really is a nice gun though, and very interesting piece of FAL and Aussie history. Now this rifle was built by my friend Steve at Honey Creek Industries many years ago, using an original Australian kit on, like I said, a DSA receiver. And that's pretty much, if you want one, what you have to do is a build. There are very few pre-ban Lithgow L1A1s. They were called L1A1As. They were imported primarily by Poirier, at least complete guns. But another two companies, Eden, who actually I think might have been first technically, and Onyx, would import L1A1A receivers from Australia. But these would just basically be receivers. Complete guns came from Poirier, and again, they were of the L1 type light barrel, standard barrel configuration. Poirier did import some sample L2A1 machine guns, but since it was post-68, they were sample guns, and I think there might have been a tiny number, like 4 or 5 semi-auto L2A1s, but it's argued if these were technically assembled in Australia or in the USA. It's also worth pointing out that some incomplete, well, I guess today we'd call them 80%, but back then that wasn't really used as much, receiver forgings were brought over and then finished out here. I believe that was mostly done by Onyx. But how many pre-bans are in the country? Numbers for Poirier are usually stated to be between 150 and 180. And then I don't know exactly how many Eden and Onyx receivers were brought over. Sorry. And I'm not sure anyone has exact records because those companies are long out of business. But my point is, if you find an L2A1, even a full auto, it was very much assembled here in the USA. I mean, there might be literally a couple that came over by other means, but yeah, let's just say they were all put together here, which is fine, because as long as they were assembled properly and the barrel and the receiver are original, that's really all that matters. But for many years, This was a kind of a white whale gun that I always wanted, either this or a C2. And really I found a C2 and this L2 at the same time, and after debate, ended up going with the L2A1 just because it had some Vietnam pedigree history, and I thought it would be nice to have an Australian type gun in the collection. Plus, the C2 wasn't, I think, 100% Canadian. I think it did have some Aussie parts on it too, because we never really got official Canadian C1 or C2 parts kits brought over, unfortunately. But anyway, I just thought I'd bring this out again, have fun talking about it a bit. It's certainly a unique rifle, and one of the prides in my collection. I only have this and an L1A1 from Britain as my so-called imperial or inch pattern FALs. As far as my metrics, I really like the Argentines, but that can be a story for another revisit video if you guys would like. But it's a lot of fun to shoot too. But it was certainly a flawed concept. It was just bigger and heavier for no real appreciable gain in the field. But, you know, they were just trying out ideas. 1960s, trying to figure things out. But yeah, if you ever get a chance, check out an L1A1, be it British or Aussie. And if you do run across a receiver marked L1A1A, know that it is quite rare. With that, I'll let you go. As always, if you could, like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help support the channel, please check out our Patreon. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.